just to move on to something different, you've talked about the Judeo-Christian heritage of Australia and the values of that, and it springs to mind a conversation I once had with an older fellow that said, Robbie, I'm an atheist, always have been, and don't believe in God, but he said, one thing I'll give you those the Christian values are a very good way to organise society and live by. You've got to give them that. And I think that's a good way to sort of invoke, the word Christianity and as it associates with our history and how it, everyone. I think today most people out there, especially young people, say, the church, that's with pedophiles and a big wealthy organisation that harbours pedophiles, and they forget the likes of Mary MacKillop and moving out the hot country places to provide poor people education and the emancipation of slaves. It was the Catholic Church or the Christian Church is fighting against the emancipation of slaves and all the great things they do. They forget that, but why do you see it as important to acknowledge that as our cultural heritage and going forward, what role it plays? Those values, not the church itself, but the Christian values, Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, earlier this year, I edited that first book you mentioned, Cancel Culture. I also edited a second one, Christianity Matters, and that has about 10 chapters explaining why Christianity underpins and actually enriches our way of life and our institutions. And, it's an area I've been looking at pretty closely over the last couple of years, because a lot of people, I grew up in a working class kind of house, and Dad was a communist and Mum was a good Catholic. So we used to have lots of good arguments and debates about Christianity and communism. But one of the things I've realised as I've got older is that Christianity underpins our institutions and way of life. One of the reasons our parliaments begin with the Lord's Prayer is because of that. And if you go back in English history to Magna Carta, to, the history of England, to our Westminster Parliament, the whole argument was there that things like the dignity of the person, the common good, social justice, treating all people equally, doesn't matter about race or colour or where you come from. If we're all made in God's image, in the New Testament, if we're all made in God's image, then we all have to treat one another, with dignity, freedom and respect. And that's part of our education system, our legal system, our parliamentary system. And I often say, people say, oh, look, the First Fleet was an invasion. Well, I say, well, hold on. 2 of the books that came with the First Fleet was the King James Bible and what they call Blackstone's Laws of England. And it's only because of those 2 books that we are a Western liberal democracy, that we're not North Korea, we're not China, we're not Russia, we're not Venezuela, we're actually Australia. And we're part of that, what they call the Anglosphere, Canada, New Zealand, America, England. And the beauty of what we have is underpinned by British Parliament, British common law and Christianity. And that's something, if we forget, it's like the air we breathe, Once you forget it, it's too late. And that's an issue why we put that book together about Christianity Matters, because a lot of young people, and there was a survey by the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney a year or 2 ago, a lot of millennials, young people, 25, 30, they couldn't understand why democracy was any good, and they couldn't understand what was bad about communism.
Yeah.
Because they've gone through an education system which really has attacked Christianity or ignored it, attacked Western culture or painted it, the black armband view, as Jeffrey Blaney says. And that's a real problem, because I'd argue to be a strong, prosperous Australia, safe, we need to understand what we should defend, and celebrate.
Yeah, good. So, I remember, I was talking in the context of talking about the Lord's Prayer before each sitting of Parliament. There was a Catholic Archbishop in Queensland said, I would argue you could have an entirely secular approach to life and still acknowledge this as a good way to start a Parliament, thinking about other people, thinking about how to honour other people, and like you say, those virtues of social justice and. It's a bit of, well, it contradicts sort of, I think, some of the main what these people say or accuse religion or Christianity of, and sort of flies in the face of that, trying to teach them to respect other people and regardless of their views. Yeah, that's it. So to bring that sort of back to some sort of a conclusion there, Kevin, that I really think the thing that rang true with what you're saying is the power of that critical thinking. It's not whether people agree with a lot of the values that you and I would share. But it's more to be able to say those freely and fearlessly in public without condemnation. That's sort of a strong part of what you're saying.
It is, and my sort of main area is literature, and I'm not a historian, but if you go back to ancient Greece and to Athens, the whole idea of getting a group of people together to argue and debate and discuss, in many ways people talk about demos, democracy. That's where it grew from. Obviously, over time, it's become a lot better, because back in the day, slaves didn't vote, women didn't vote. So we have had the ability to actually improve what we have and to make it better, to make it fairer, and we respect people's freedoms and liberties. But it's based on that very strong belief that the best way to solve an issue, Chairman Mao during the Cultural Revolution talked about the power of the gun, that the whole idea was to settle it with violence. And that's what Putin is doing with invading the Crimea a couple of years ago, and now the Ukraine. I mean, dictators, whether it's Hitler or Putin or Stalin or Pol Pot, they use violence. And that's what I'm worried about, because increasingly a lot of young people are turning to violence. Now, whether it's graffiti or pulling down statues or, demonstrating, closing Sydney Harbour Bridge or gluing themselves to the road, stopping people getting to work. A lot of people now are starting to think, well, violence is okay. But that's not the way, because before you know it, we're going to be in all kinds of trouble. So what I've always argued is we've got to educate young people, teach young people about those Christian virtues, about our democratic values, about our way of life based on reason, rationality, being objective. And, the expression, he without sin cast the first stone. We have to understand that all people, we're not perfect. We don't have the solution all the time, but it's only through that discourse, that debate, that argument, getting different points of view, that you can hopefully arrive at what is the best way forward. And that used to be the idea of Parliament, that you would get the opposition and the government, you'd get minor parties. And that's why, one of the things when I was Chief of Staff with Kevin Andrews during the Liberal government, John Howard government, one of the things that worried me was that politics was kind of becoming too much about a stoush, about adversarial, about I'm not going to listen, I'm in charge, I'm in control, bugger off. And that's not the way, because these issues are far too important. And the issues affect everyday Australians, every day of the week, every month, every year. And we only have to look at the price of petrol, what's happening with the the price of food. People can't buy a house. People can't rent because they don't have the money. All of these issues come back to everyday living. And that's why we have to talk and discuss. And congratulations, for having your attempt at having sort of conversations like this. Because it's only through getting people to listen and think and talk that you can kind of raise the bar and hopefully get people to be a bit more aware.
Yeah. That's the challenge, isn't it? I read a book there, The Unconscious Civilization. That was back in the 90s, I think, came out. John Ralston Saul, but just that title alone, we just seem to be so sort of unconscious of what's how things are evolving, and it's not to say either side's right or wrong, but just without questioning things and losing.
Yeah, we're kind of
argue it.
I use the expression we're kind of sleepwalking into it. We're kind of sleepwalking.
Yeah.
And that's the danger because, as I said, like the air we breathe, once it's gone, it's too late.
Yeah. And
that used to be the role of education.
Right.
That used to be like 12 years, 10 years of school. You were given that grounding in our way of life, in our history, our literature, our science, our mathematics. And that gave young people the ability to see what was going on. But now a lot of kids are going through school and it's like it's indoctrination. It's being pushed by the cultural left. So a lot of kids don't understand. And that's why in that survey I mentioned, a lot of young kids couldn't understand why democracy was better than communism.
Yep.
It's kind of scary it's come to that.
Yeah, it sure is. I think, a closing point on reflection of what you're saying, I remember being brought up by my father, Bob, who's, probably seen as really set in his ways and conservative on a lot of values. But strangely enough, that's my recollection of my childhood is sort of having a preconditioned view on things, and Dad really challenging me, probably against the way most people would think, to say, well, that's not right. And I was really frustrated at the time because you're young and you want those containers and to think everything's right this direction. But particularly on some of those, social justice or economic issues where, it was really challenging. And but I find, people like Dad that have been in that seat for so long on the battlefront just have become so polarised, have had to dig in so hard that, there's less and less space to have that respectful conversation, that it becomes more, you need to be so strong and aggressive in your approach to try and get anywhere, because it feels like the walls are closing in on your ability to speak about it. I think it's a big challenge ahead, and really grateful for people like yourself to at least provide a voice and try and articulate these big cultural movements we've got, and trying to make sense of why blokes can compete in women's sports and those sort of things now, and trying to get a few of the whys behind it.
Well, in Tasmania now, as you know, you can change your birth certificate. So, you can be born a boy or a girl, but 10, 20 years later, you can suddenly think, oh, hold on, I'm not a boy. I'm LGBTQI+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer. Like this whole category now of you can be whatever you want. And who would have thought it had come to that, you know what I mean? That they now, you don't say, I had a baby, or, what's it like, Dad? You can't say Dad. It's got to be something else. And you don't have breastfeeding anymore. You have chest feeding, because they don't want to upset anyone. It's kind of, we're gone, like I used to read the kids Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. It's like we've gone down the rabbit hole, where language doesn't mean anything, common sense doesn't mean anything. It's kind of a bit wacky, but it's true.
Yes. C.S. Lewis said once that the word gentleman used to had a very defined meaning. It meant you were of land and property. You could be an absolute scoundrel, but you had land and property, and so you knew if someone said gentleman, you knew exactly what it meant, and that made it easy to operate. And you don't mess around with language in medicine, which they actually do a bit now, which can have implications. But you don't mess around with language because it has some indicators and these slow incremental deviations, what means what, and it's an interesting.
And the other example I give, I was in Hobart on the weekend, and I said to the audience I was talking to, I drove across I flew Melbourne Hobart. I'm glad the pilot knew about physics and mathematics and about gravity and thrust, and I'm glad he'd been taught the Western way, the Western science, the Western maths. And then I went across the bridge into Hobart. I'm glad the bridge is standing because you need to know all this stuff. You got to get it right. You can't just make it up as you go.
Yep.
Or you can't be woke and say, you can't just make it up.
Yep.
There's a science behind it. Yeah.
And who becomes the arbiter in this? Because if we can't debate it in Parliament, and we can't, if there's no safe space to debate this stuff and argue it, who's then making the decision direction we go? Is it, they say Mark Zuckerberg has all this power. Well, who's the Mark Zuckerberg and our legal system here? And,
That's right.
It's not on Facebook where Mark Zuckerberg controls it. Who's controlling all this? Because it's not the democratically elected people if we can't argue about it properly in Parliament. It's very rare that people get to listen to the sense of reason and the other side of the argument. But I appreciate the job you do, mate, and thanks for your time here today.
Yeah, no problem. Just quickly, if people want to learn more about me, there's my webpage, Kevin Donnelly, one word, .com.au.